You think you can just waltz onto a man and oppose as property and lay a hand on a child because you've got a plastic badge and a clipboard. Well, you're about to find out exactly why some doors are better left unknocked, especially when the guy living behind them has spent 2 decades training for the kind of violence you only see in movies. My name's Wyatt, and for 22 years I operated in the shadows as a Navy SEAL, dealing with real monsters in corners of the world you'll never find on a map. So when I finally hung up the uniform and moved to this quiet, sun-drenched cul-de-sac in North Carolina, all I wanted was to fix up old motorcycles and watch my 12-year-old son, Leo, grow into a man who didn't have to carry a rifle for a living. The trouble with quiet neighborhoods is that they attract people who have far too much time on their hands and a desperate, starving hunger for a tiny bit of power. And in our case, that hunger wore the face of a woman named Beatrice who ran the local homeowners association with the zeal of a backyard dictator. Now, the first thing you need to know, the absolute kicker of this whole mess, is that my house ISN and oppos to even in her jurisdiction because the county line cuts right through the Oak Grove 2 blocks down, meaning I pay my taxes to the county and answer to the sheriff, not some board of retirees who get offended by the shade of green on your lawn. I told Beatrice this the first time she waddled on my driveway with a frown that looked like it had been carved into her face by years of judging people. But logic doesn't in oppos to work on people like her. She just narrowed those beady eyes and told me that, in quote, community standards are a state of mind, in quote, and that I'd be, in quote, integrated, in quote, whether I liked it or not. It started small, the way these things always do, with those passive-aggressive yellow slips tucked under my windshield wiper complaining about the, in quote, audible disturbance, in quote, of my 1974 shovelhead engine, or the way my trash can stayed out 5 minutes past noon on pickup day. And I just tossed them in the bin, laughing it off as suburban theater. But then it got darker. The notes stopped being about lawn height and started being about, in quote, unauthorized occupants, in quote, and, in quote, safety risks, in quote, and I'd catch these guys in black polos with, in quote, neighborhood enforcement, in quote, embroidered on the chest lurking by my fence with long lens cameras. I'm a SEAL, I know, when I'm being surveilled, and I could smell the amateur hour on these guys from a mile away, but it still gets under your skin when you're trying to raise a son in peace and you feel eyes on your back every time you go out to get the mail. Leo is a good kid, tough but quiet. He knew the drill about not talking to the clipboard brigade, but Beatrice was escalating. She started sending these, in quote, safety inspectors, in quote, who claimed they had a right to enter my garage to check for combustible hazards. And every time, I meet them at the gate with a look that usually made grown men reconsider their life choices, telling them to get a warrant or get lost. I thought that was the end of it. I thought she'd eventually get bored and find some poor guy with a messy flower bed to bully, but I underestimated the nesting instinct of a narcissist who's been told, in quote, no, in quote, for the first time in her life. It was a Tuesday, one of those thick, humid southern mornings where the air feels like a wet blanket, and I'd popped out for 20 minutes to the local Ace Hardware to grab a specific set of torque wrenches we needed for Leo's dirt bike project, leaving him in the garage with the radio playing some old-school rock and the side door cracked for a breeze. I was gone for such a short time that the coffee in my cup holder was still steaming when I turned back onto our street. But as I rounded the corner, I saw a black SUV parked crookedly across the mouth of my driveway, and my internal alarm, the one that kept me alive in Kandahar, started screaming at a frequency that made my teeth ache. I didn't even park, I just jumped out of the truck while it was still rolling into the grass and hit the ground running. And that's when I heard it, a sound that no father ever forgets, the sharp, panicked gasp of his child being manhandled. I cleared the corner of the garage in 2 strides, and what I saw turned my blood into pure, cold nitrogen because there was this guy, a mountain of man with tribal tattoos crawling up his neck and a fake tactical vest that said, in quote, HOA compliance, in quote, in big white letters, and he had Leo by the upper arm, actually lifting him off his feet while trying to shove him toward the back of that SUV. Leo's face was pale, his lip was bleeding like he'd been backhanded, and he was struggling, kicking at the guy's shins, but he was just a kid against a guy who clearly enjoyed being a bully for hire. I didn't shout a warning, I didn't in oppos. T asked for identification. I just transitioned into that space where everything slows down and the only thing that exists is the objective, and before that guy could even register the sound of my boots on the concrete, I was on him. I hit him with a lead pipe forearm to the throat just to kill his breath. And as he stumbled back, Releasing Leo, I didn't in Oppos. T stop, I grabbed his wrist and his elbow in a simultaneous move that I practiced 10,000 times, and I applied a downward spiral torque that used his own momentum against him. There was this dry, sickening crack, like a heavy branch snapping in a winter storm, as his humerus gave way, and he let out this high-pitched, warbling shriek that didn't end Oppos. T sound human at all, but I wasn't into Oppos. T done, not by a long shot. He tried to reach for a folding knife, clipped to his belt with his good hand, and I just stepped into his guard, drove a knee into his floating ribs with enough force to collapse his lung, and watched him fold into a heap on the oil-stained floor of my garage. I had him zip-tied with his own enforcement, restraints before his brain even processed the pain, and I sat him up against the wall, gasping and clutching his mangled arm, while I pulled Leo behind me, checking his face and making sure he was okay, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. Who sent you? I asked, my voice coming out in that low, terrifying whisper that means someone is very close to meeting their maker, and the guy just looked at me with pupils like pinpricks, muttering through the blood in his mouth about, the board, and how I was, resisting a lawful inspection, It was pathetic, really, this grown man crying on my floor because he thought playing cop for a HOA was a fun way to make an extra $50 an hour, but the real show was just beginning because just then the SUV door opened and out stepped Beatrice, looking like she was ready to film a segment for the evening news. She had her hair in a perfect bob, her pearls on, and that damn clipboard held like a shield, and she actually had the audacity to walk toward my garage with a smirk, saying, Now, Wyatt, there's no need for theatrics, we're just conducting a standard, She stopped dead when she saw her hired muscle crumpled on the ground like a discarded rag. I walked out to meet her on the driveway, the sun hitting my face, and I told her, Beatrice, I've told you 3 times that I'm not in your HOA, and now you've sent an armed man to kidnap my son and assault him on my property. So I want you to look at me very closely and understand that the only reason you aren't in Oppos, T laying next to him, is because I want you conscious to watch the police take you away in handcuffs. The color drained out of her face until she looked like a ghost, and she started stammering about, safety protocols, and how the boy was, obstructing an official inquiry, But the neighbors were already coming out of their houses, phones in hand, recording the whole thing, and the sound of sirens was already beginning to wail from the main road. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, Beatrice tried to play the victim. She actually tried to tell them that I had, viciously attacked a community servant, But I just pointed at the 4K Nest camera tucked under the eaves of my garage, the one that had recorded every single second of that guy tatting my son and trying to drag him into a vehicle. The shift in the atmosphere was instant. The deputies didn't in Oppos to even look at Beatrice's, permits, They just saw a bruised 12-year-old and a man with a fake badge who had broken into a private residence, and they treated it exactly like what it was, a felony, kidnapping, and assault. They hauled that guy off to the hospital first, then to the county jail, and as for Beatrice, her, authority, evaporated in the back of a cruiser while the neighbors cheered. Actually cheered as she was driven away, her clipboard left lying in the gutter like the trash it was. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal filings and depositions, and it turned out Beatrice had been skimming funds from the actual HOA members to pay this, enforcement team, of hers, a group of failed security guards and wannabe tough guys she used to intimidate anyone who crossed her. She ended up taking a plea deal that put her in state prison for 4 years, but the damage was done, the, community, she loved so much was shattered, and my son, well, Leo's okay now. He's got a bit of a scar on his lip, and he's a lot more careful about locking the doors. But he also knows that his dad will move heaven and earth to keep him safe. Looking back, I wonder if I went too far, if I should have just called the cops and waited. But when you see a stranger in Oppos, S hand on your child, you don in Oppos, T think about, reasonable force, you think about survival. So I'm curious, to all of you listening out there, what would you have done in my shoes? If you came home and found fake cop, trying to take your kid because of some imaginary property rule, would you have waited for the law to show up? Or would you have taken justice into your own hands like I did? Was I a protector Or did I just become the very thing I spent my life fighting? Let me know in the comments, because in this neighborhood, the lines between right and wrong got blurred a long time ago, and I'm still trying to figure out if I'm the hero of this story or just the most dangerous man on the block.